Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Carried on, but your heart was tired. Feared the worst and felt the fire. Lay it all down. Lay it all down. Filled with all those anxious thoughts, and all your doubts became your God. Lay it all down. Lay it all down. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment I wake up till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You've led me through the fire. In darkest night, you were close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God.
Hey, good morning, Crosspoint. So good to be with you today, and I hope you're able to celebrate Thanksgiving this past weekend with some people that you love and that love you. As usual, we have a lot of things going on as we kick off the Christmas and holiday season, and I want to just take a moment and point you toward those. Once again this year, we're partnering with the White Oak Foundation to provide over 500 specialized gifts for 48 different families. Now, these are all families that we've personally spoken to, we've received specific requests from, and that are in real need this season. And so, wherever you are in the world, if you want to help infuse some joy into our neighbors to help remind them that they're not forgotten, you can go to crosspoint.org/joy to the world. You can view all the gifts there for members of every age in these families. You can sign up to provide those gifts, and you can find out information on how to get the gifts delivered by mail to the church or times that you can drop them off at our local campus. Again, that's crosspoint.org/joy to the world. As we try to highlight on a regular basis, because of your generosity to this community, we're able to pay bills every single week for people that are hurting and in need of help. And one of the most consistent financial needs we come across is rent. Now, obviously, we're going to continue to do that throughout the season, but we want to do so much more than just pay bills. We as a church want to be a part of getting to the root of the problems that exist and be a part of trying to change the situation. So this coming Tuesday night at Theology in Court, November 30th at 7 p.m. via Zoom, we're going to be speaking with Devin Ross of the organization One Wake. Now, you can come just to listen and learn. You can participate in the conversation, ask questions if you want. And our hope is that some of you will actually be interested in joining a team to help Crosspoint move strategically toward advocacy for affordable housing in the area. So again, if you're interested, that's this Tuesday night, November 30th at 7 p.m. You can find out more information about Theology in Court and a link for the Zoom conversation at crosspoint.org/adults. Now, another major event we hold during the Christmas season is our Remember service each year. And for much of this season, we're confronted with parties and fun decorations and calls to be joyful, and those certainly have their place. But for many of us, there's also grief and heartache due to the loss of a loved one or the ending of a marriage or career. For others of us, we find ourselves grieving unfulfilled dreams or strained relationships. And nearly 2 years into a pandemic, most all of us are carrying some kind of grief. And so it's a high priority for us to make space for that grief to be honored, to make space for remembering that which was lost, and to also make a point to journey together in our grief. And so this year, our annual Remember service will be held Wednesday night, December 8th at 7 p.m. There will be 2 options this year. There will be a virtual and an in-person event. Registration is not required, but for some aspects of the service, it would be helpful if you would just take a moment to register. And so in order to do that and to find out more information, you go to crosspoint.org/remember. And then lastly, as always, none of this happens without those of us who believe we can do way more together to love and serve people by leveraging our resources and our generosity together to do more good in the world. And so if you want to contribute financially to fund this community and all that happens day in and day out, I'd invite you to go to crosspoint.org/contribute. You'll find ways there to contribute via credit or debit cards, check, text, PayPal, stocks, etc. And you can set up one-time or recurring contributions however you want to set it up. As always, it's an honor to be in this community with you. So what I want to do today is I want to walk through a story that an author, John, records in his account of Jesus' life, and pretty much walk through it verse by verse. And then I want to share with you what I think is a critically important and helpful principle that I think can immediately improve all of our relationships if we allow it to. And then lastly, I just want to offer you a couple observations on what I think we need to see more of in these days in our world. So that's where we're going to go this morning. The story starts this way. John chapter 9, verse 1. It says, walking down the street, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind? So, Jesus and his closest followers, they come up on this blind man and they ask him, Jesus, who was it that messed up here? I mean, whose fault is this? Because the common understanding for any type of sickness or physical limitation was that you were paying for someone else's sin. Either your own sin or a sin committed by your parents or some other ancestor in your lineage. Essentially, it was viewed as a punishment of some kind. Now, from the outside looking in, we can look at that way of thinking as rather archaic or naive, but the reality is it's still a prominent default to how many of us think today. I mean, after all, when suffering comes, many times the first questions that come to mind are, what did I do to deserve this? And we start racking our brains, what could I have done? Trying to figure out how and why this, whatever it is, happened to us. And you know, people weren't all that different a couple thousand years ago in that way. And so they posed this question to Jesus. Jesus, who sinned here? Who messed up that this man is blind? Verse 3, Jesus said, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no such cause effect here. Look instead for what God can do. So very quickly, Jesus completely dismisses the established paradigm for how a person's situation like this was understood. Jesus is like, this man didn't sin. His parents didn't sin. That's not what happened. That's not what's happening here. And while that may seem like an obvious statement to some of us today, it was like dropping a bomb into these people's worldview at the time. Rather, Jesus shifts their focus from trying to figure out the answer to why this man is blind to rather helping them wrestle with, what do we think God's going to do about it? What can God do through this particular situation that's in front of us? Verse 6. He said this, and then he spit in the dust, made a clay paste with the saliva, rubbed the paste on the blind man's eyes, and said, "Go wash at the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. The man went and washed and saw. Now, something that often gets overlooked here is that this is the Middle East, right? I mean, it's dry, it's dusty, it's desert. And so what that tells us about Jesus is that he must have been a rather impressive spitter. If you're the Son of God, I guess it makes sense that he would be great at spitting. We just don't often associate normal human functions with Jesus. Like, we get in our head that he just prayed and read Hebrew scriptures all the time, but we don't tend to imagine Jesus having things like great jokes and being able to spit really well. But apparently, at least in terms of the latter, that's the case here. Verse 8, soon the town was buzzing. His relatives and those who year after year had seen him as a blind man begging were saying, Why isn't this the man we knew? Isn't this the man we knew who sat here and begged? Others says, it's him all right. But others objected, it's not the same man at all. It just looks like him. He said, it's me, the very one. So this guy, he starts coming back to where he lives, and people start debating whether or not it's really him. Wait, isn't that the blind kid? I think that's the blind kid. No. He only looks like him. You don't know what you're talking about. And all along, here's this guy saying, listen, I'm telling you, it's me. I'm the guy. But others are still like, yeah, I don't know. Verse 10, they said, how did your eyes get opened? So at this point, now they're demanding an explanation. If this is really you, if this actually happened to you, then explain it. Explain how it happened. So the man recounts the story for them. Verse 11. Well, a man named Jesus made a paste and he rubbed it on my eyes and told me, go to Siloam and wash. I did what he said, and when I washed, I saw. So where is he then? I don't know. Now imagine if you're this guy, you're getting pretty frustrated by this point, right? He's got to be like, does anybody want to celebrate with me that I was blind just a few minutes ago and now I can see? And all you want to do is argue with me. Really? Does no one want to celebrate? But the crowd keeps demanding some type of explanation. So look at what happens next, verse 13. It says, they marched the man to the Pharisees. This day when Jesus made the paste and healed his blindness was the Sabbath. The Pharisees, these religious leaders, grilled him again on how he had come to see. He said, he put a clay paste on my eyes and I washed and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, obviously this man can't be from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. Here's the most prominent group of religious leaders of the day. And essentially what they're saying is, we know exactly what God is like. We know how God will act and how God won't act. There's no way God's going to heal someone on the Sabbath. So this man, Jesus, can't be from God. And here's the thing to keep in mind. They had scriptures to back that belief up. Ones that they could point to and say, see, it says right here. And so they were insistent. What has happened here doesn't make sense with how we view God, with how we interpret scripture. And so the only conclusion then must be that this can't be from God. This can't be something God is up to. Even though it may appear to everyone as a good and beautiful thing, God can't work this way, not on a Sabbath. There's scriptures that say that can't happen. And the loudest, most confident, most scripturally educated people of the time were wrong. They missed what God was up to. Friends, that's a reality that should always keep you and I very humble. Still, there were ones there that were like, wait, okay, this doesn't add up. John writes, others countered, how can a bad man do miraculous God revealing things like this? There was a split in their ranks. Because you see, there were these other religious leaders in the mix who were like, wait, okay, How can we reconcile someone healing someone so dramatically and that person not being aligned with God? So what we find is that these religious leaders are debating among themselves as to what has actually happened. We read this, verse 17. They came back at the blind man. You're the expert. He opened your eyes. What do you say about him? He said, he's a prophet. Now, there's really no way to know this, but from the context, I imagine this blind man saying this more like, he's a prophet? Because really, up to this point, he doesn't have a clue. He's just been like, there's this man they call Jesus. He put paste and mud on my eyes, told me to wash, and then I can see. But they keep grilling him. And so finally, he's like, I guess he's a prophet? We read this, verse 18. The Jews didn't believe it. Didn't believe the man was blind to begin with. So they called the parents of the man now bright-eyed with sight. They asked him, is this your son, the one you say was born blind? So how is it that he now sees? His parents said, we know he is our son, and we know he was born blind, but we don't know how he came to see. Haven't a clue about who opened his eyes. Why don't you ask him? He's a grown man and can speak for himself. And then John adds this. He says his parents were talking like this because they were intimidated by the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who took a stand that this was the Messiah would be kicked out of the meeting place. That's why his parents said, ask him. He's a grown man. Now, it's important for us, for you and I, to understand the weight of the situation here, because we may be tempted to think, kicked out of the meeting place, I mean, what's the big deal about that? But this meeting place was their synagogue. And to be kicked out of the synagogue was the same thing as being officially labeled as a heretic by the church. You were publicly humiliated. It was essentially declared by the church that you could never be right with God, and therefore you would be an outcast in society in every respect of the word. And so these parents are put into a situation where everything is on the line for them, and they don't have an explanation for what's happened. They don't have any grand theological insight. All they know is that because of this man Jesus, their son isn't blind anymore. But they can't explain it. And if they give credit to Jesus, their lives are essentially over, and so they're stuck. And so they say, you know what? Ask our son. He can speak for himself. They called the man back a second time, the man who had been blind, and told him, give credit to God. We know this man, again, they're referring to Jesus, is an imposter. So how do they know that? Because again, they're like, we know what God is like, what God does, what God doesn't do, what God thinks, what God doesn't think. We have God in this nice little box, and what has happened here is outside that box, outside of the boundaries for what is allowed for by God. So therefore, this Jesus can't be from God. But listen to how this man born blind responds, verse 25. He replied, I know nothing about that one way or the other, but I know one thing for sure. I was blind, and now I see. And he's like, listen, I don't have an explanation for you. I can't explain who Jesus is or who he isn't. I can't explain how he did the whole thing with the spit and the mud. I can't explain how this happened on a Sabbath when you have scriptures that say no work can be done on the Sabbath. I can't explain any of that. But here's the one thing I know. I was blind, but now I see. Verse 26, they said, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? I've told you over and over, and you haven't listened. Why do you want to hear it again? Are you so eager to become his disciples? Now, this guy gets so frustrated that he's finally like, apparently you're so interested in this Jesus. Is that because you want to follow him too? Is that what really is going on? Well, that did it. That just pushed him over the edge. Verse 28. With that, they jumped all over him. You might be a disciple of that man, but we're disciples of Moses. We know for sure that God spoke to Moses, but we have no idea where this man even comes from. The man replied, this is amazing. You claim to know nothing about him, but the fact is he opened my eyes. It's well known that God isn't at the beck and call of sinners, but listens carefully to anyone who lives in reverence and does his will. That someone opened the eyes of a man born blind has never been heard of. Someone doing that's never been heard of before. If this man didn't come from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. They said, you're nothing but dirt. How dare you take that tone with us? and they threw him out in the street. Again, what we have here is the religious leaders declaring, we know how God works and how God doesn't work. How dare you question us? We determine whether or not this man is approved by God or not, whether God is with him or not, and we say he's not. And they threw him out. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out and went and found him. He asked him, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now that was a nickname for the Messiah, the Anointed One. And the man said, point him out to me, sir, so that I can believe in him. Jesus said, you're looking right at him. Don't you recognize my voice? Master, I believe, the man said, and worshiped him. Jesus then said, I came into the world to bring everything into the clear light of day, making all the distinctions clear so that those who have never seen will see, and those who have made a great pretense of seeing will be exposed as blind. Now, there's several different things that we could draw out with this story and discuss, but for today, I want us to notice that this man who once was blind was marched by the local followers of God to the religious leaders, and yet they don't know the man previously. They don't know his story. They don't know his context. They're simply presented with a version of a story, and they're asked to judge the situation from the outside. They're asked to judge the man, what has happened, to judge this man, Jesus. All these perspectives from the outside are asked to look in and judge this situation. And to most of them, it seems pretty simple because the logic goes like this. Well, the scriptures make it crystal clear that a man can't work on the Sabbath. Clearly, healing someone involves a measure of work. Therefore, the only logical conclusion, the only God-honoring and scripture-honoring conclusion is either this man is lying and he wasn't ever blind to begin with, or this man, Jesus, is evil. He's performing some type of dark magic because clearly he doesn't follow the scriptures. And for those who were far away from the situation, that simple binary logic made a lot of sense. It's either this or it's that. But then we have the people that were actually living the circumstances, that were being judged. This man and his parents who were dealing with the reality of the situation they found themselves in. And what we discover is that for those closest to the situation actually had a lot of layers. It wasn't simple at all. For the man who was blind, it was, I don't know what I think exactly when it comes to who Jesus is. I mean, I don't know how to reconcile it. There's these scripture verses that I've honored my whole life that say this isn't supposed to happen or that God wouldn't approve of it happening. And I get that it's really plain and simple for you, but I can't deny what I've actually experienced. And the situation isn't very simple for the man's parents either, right? I mean, they're put into a situation where everything's on the line for them, and they don't have an explanation for what's happened. They don't have any grand theological insight. All they know is that because of this man, Jesus, their son isn't blind anymore, but they can't explain it. And yet, if they give credit to Jesus, their lives are essentially over, and so they're stuck. It's not plain and simple. Rather, it's pretty complicated. And so here's why I wanted to point out these particular observations from this story. It's because they illustrate an important principle. It's not original with me. I think I first heard it years ago from an author, Andy Stanley. I remember writing it down, and I've come back to it over and again through the years as this important filter to keep in front of mind, not only relationally, but just as we navigate various conversations in our culture today. And the principle is this: the further away you are from a situation, the simpler it often looks. Yet, the closer you are to a situation, the more complex it becomes. Now, let's think about that for a moment. Because we see that principle play out in this story from the Bible, but we often approach a lot of stories in the scriptures the same way. It's one of the reasons we try to spend a lot of time around here exploring the historical context of what we find in the Bible, trying to put ourselves in the situation, what it looked like then, what cultural tensions were at play at the time, how language worked then, if there were certain phrases or ideas that were popular at the time that the original hearers would have understood drastically different than how you and I hear them today. Because the reality is, you and I are looking at the situation from quite a distance. Not just figuratively in terms of culture, but from a literal 2,000 years ahead in the future. And yet, it's easy for us to think things like, you know what? Things would be completely different for me if I could just see the resurrected Jesus for myself. I mean, trusting God would be so much simpler. Faith would be so much simpler if Jesus would just stand right here in front of me. And that's easy to assume from a distance. But then we read about those who were close to the situation and claim that they actually did see Jesus resurrected in the flesh, where Matthew writes this: when they saw him, when the disciples saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Right after Jesus is resurrected, they saw him, some worshiped him, but some doubted. So you have these followers of Jesus, right, who had spent 3 years with Jesus. They had watched him be crucified on a cross and buried, and now they're looking at him resurrected in the flesh in front of them. And we read that thousands of years later and think, what do you mean some doubted? They're looking at Jesus face to face. How much more simple could things be? But for those actually in the moment, for those close to the situation who had spent their whole lives living with a certain perspective and being taught by every authority in their life what the Messiah was supposed to look like, this didn't match up with that. Then, in the moment, they certainly had to be playing out in their heads, I'm looking at a man I just saw dead and buried 3 days ago. Am I going crazy? Because this doesn't seem possible. I mean, what other possible explanation could there be for what I'm staring at right in front of me? Because none of this lines up with how I understand life and reality works. You see, for those disciples actually in that situation, it was way more complicated than we may assume today, than we may assume if it would be up for us if we were in that same situation. Because the principle holds up. The further away you are from a situation, the simpler it often looks. Yet, the closer you are to a situation, the more complex it becomes. So, let's tease that out a bit more practically for a moment. Think about various relationships in your life. Ever notice how when you're listening to someone else talk about struggles they have with a relationship in their life, often the solution can seem really simple and obvious to you. But if you're the one in the relationship, if you're the one facing the problem and someone says to you, listen, all you have to do is, and then they make this solution sound so simple, so obvious, our knee-jerk reaction oftentimes is to feel annoyed. It's like, wait a second. The situation isn't that simple. It's way more complicated than that. There's all these different factors at play. There's this to consider and that to consider. And it's because we know it's complex, because we're in the middle of it. Now, the reality is, sometimes each of us do get overwhelmed at the complexity of a situation, and our emotions can easily cloud our perspective. And in those moments, it's very helpful to get an outside, unbiased perspective to help sort through that. And often that can bring clarity. That can be a real gift. And if you've been around Crosspoint for any length of time, you know how much we advocate for good counseling. So this isn't a knock on seeking outside wisdom in any way. Rather, it's simply drawing attention to the tensions that result when people who are further away from a situation don't recognize that the closer someone is to a situation, the more complex it is. Because they know and understand way more facts about the situation than you do. Now, here's the thing. When we don't understand this principle or choose to ignore it, it significantly dials up the tension and conflict between people and groups of people. You see this play out with parents and teenagers often. When a teenager tries to explain the stresses they're facing at school or with their friends, and a parent responds with something that begins like, listen, there's a very simple solution. All you have to do is, or it comes off like, hey, listen, if you would do this, then all these problems would go away. Because from a distance, the solution seems simple. But that type of attitude of all you have to do is can easily shut a teen down because they don't feel listened to. They don't feel like someone's actually trying to understand the complex world that they're trying to navigate. But the same thing is true in reverse, right? Where some of you who are teenagers often think, well, you know what, if I was in charge, this would be such an easy decision. If I was the parent, I know exactly what I would do. If I was the teacher, if I was the coach in this situation. When the reality is there are a lot of factors and tensions in play that make the situation way more complex from a parent's or authority's perspective that you weren't aware of. And that frankly, you just can't be aware of simply based on life experience up to this point. But again, it's often a matter of not being aware of this principle. The further you are from a situation, the simpler it often looks, yet the closer you are to a situation, the more complex it becomes. You see, when you're not aware of that principle and then fail to use it as a filter for your comments, whether face-to-face with people or with something you post online, then conflict and tensions increase. To get even more practical, I think this is one of the main contributors to the divide in the conversation around racial tensions in our country right now. Where from my perspective, too many white people jump into the conversation in regards to police shootings and recent court cases with comments that start off with, listen, if they just would have, or listen, this is really simple. All you have to do is, and in doing so, it comes off as, to many people of color, as dismissive. It comes off as someone from a distance presenting that the solutions are really simple and therefore communicates this unwillingness to entertain that the situation and the feelings of frustration and anger may be way more complex and may have way more context for those closest to the situation, to those people of color who are actually living in our culture today. And again, the result when that happens is tensions and conflict only increase. People stop listening to each other. Another place we see it is with all the different viewpoints around the COVID vaccines right now. And just to be really clear, I'm pro-vaccine. My entire family and I got ours as soon as we were eligible and will continue to. And my hope is that everyone who can will as well. I think it's wise. I think it's a way that we love each other and our neighbors. But for people on the pro side of vaccines, it can be very tempting from a distance simply to shame and demonize anyone who hasn't gotten it. And in that process, fail to listen to people and their concerns. I mean, sure, some people are just being obstinate for the sake of giving the finger to any authority that they want to. But when you take the time to get close to people and listen to their stories, what you'll also find is that there are a lot of people who are terrified, paralyzed by fear. And that many times, it's a fear that has legitimate and understandable context behind it. And when people are terrified, you approach them way differently than those that are just obstinate. But you can't know that from a distance. You only discover that up close. You see, because whenever we enter a conversation regarding faith or politics, relationships, race, morality, vaccines, whatever it is, and lead with, listen, it's really simple. What that does is it tends to only build up walls. It accelerates conflict because it communicates a tremendous lack of understanding of the complexities of the reality of someone else's experience. And in doing so, communicates the exact opposite of love. It's why this principle is such an important filter to have in the conversation. That the further away you are from a situation, the simpler it often looks. Yet the closer you are to a situation, the more complex it becomes. And so in light of all of that, a couple last things that I want to leave you with. Let's look back to the last thing Jesus said in the story that we looked at earlier in verse 39. Jesus then said, I came into the world to bring everything into the clear light of day, making all the distinctions clear so that those who have never seen will see, and those who have made a great pretense of seeing will be exposed as blind. And so in our desire to love other people well, often one of the most loving things we can do is to remind ourselves just how blind you and I are. Now, we don't often tend to think of love that way, of starting with ourselves, but in the context of actually trying to navigate conversations that are usually filled with some sort of relational tension, it's a great way to start. And so in the midst of a variety of tense conversations happening in our culture right now, it goes a long way if you find yourself engaging in one of those, whether in person or online, to acknowledge something to the effect of, you know what? I know I'm blind to a lot of the complexities of your situation, but I want to try to understand if you'll help me. And then just listen. And listen some more. Especially when you're at a distance. Because that's what loving well looks like. And then one last thing. This weekend kicks off the traditional season of Advent. And this Sunday traditionally centers around the idea of hope. And hope is something that we all want and need, right? But here's the thing about hope. It's often way easier to appear hopeful when you stay at a distance from the reality of a situation. And a lot of us can do that. But it's not really hope. We disguise it as hope, but it's not really that. It's more of this naive, blind optimism. And for some of us, that's actually what we think faith is. It's just this naive, blind optimism. Because once we get close to a situation, once we dive in and choose to become aware of the complexities and the tensions that exist, it's much easier just to default to cynicism. Have you ever noticed that? Author Ernest Hemingway noticed something similar when he wrote this: happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know. It's this sense that once You choose to become intelligently informed when you draw close and become aware of the nuances. That naive optimism that one can maintain from a distance, it just kind of vanishes and goes away. But here's my challenge to all of us. It's extremely compelling and powerful when people who are close to a situation, close to a problem, resist giving in to full-on cynicism and fight to be hopeful. Where they can see and acknowledge all the layers and complexities, and rather than just throwing their hands up in the air, they're willing to do the hard, persistent work of fighting for hope and living that hope out, because that's actually what changes things. And so, as we enter in this season of Advent together, where we celebrate a God who didn't stay off at a distance, but came close in the flesh, into the midst of all the mess, and inspired us to hope, may you and I follow that same pattern with how we live our lives and how we love others here and now. Your loved Crosspoint. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.